Well, this is going to upset a few. Your ports are turbulent, but let me explain. All right, welcome back, guys, to another induction series. We're going to dive into a few topics today. We're going to cover Kolmogorov's theory. We're going to get into saturation points, which I haven't covered yet. This will explain a lot of cylinder head problems people see when they get to certain lifts. We're also going to cover our MCA dynamic, because we've still got people struggling with this dynamic calculation, and also talk about pressure gradients. A lot of people focus on velocity gradients and no one ever looks at the actual pressure gradient inside a port. And this will tell us a lot, because I have some people saying, you know, at that sort of speeds, air starts becoming compressible. That's absolute rubbish. Air is pretty much compressible as soon as it moves, technically, but it really starts getting compressible over about 100 feet per second. So when people say, oh, 710, that's super quick and now we're getting into compressible fluids, you're not understanding what you're actually dealing with. So anything when we move, we're creating pressure differential. By me just going like that, I'm creating more pressure on this side of my hand and I'm creating a low pressure on here. We are dealing with a compressible fluid, especially air, and it's super, super sensitive. And this feeds into Kolmogorov's theory of that degradation of eddies and stuff like that. And this is why we'll get into why ports are turbulent, but not in the traditional sense that you'll think. All right, let's dig in a bit more. So what I thought I'd do is we'd cover some basic physics of fluid dynamics, because some people are really struggling and I totally understand why. So we're going to cover why they're compressible and the difference between laminar flow and turbulent flow, and why people get confused, because a lot of cylinder head guys out there will say, oh, the port turned turbulent or went turbulent, or we hear this, we hear it constantly in the game. And it's not that the port turned turbulent, it's that the turbulence got out of control or we've seen separation. And that's always a problem, because separation and too much turbulence will create that dynamic CSA that I talked about. It'll shrink the port. So we're going to get into a little bit of Newtonian physics and understand why air is a Newtonian fluid. And if you've picked up a textbook in the last 20 years, you'll know about the Moody diagram and you'll know about these two, and also this diagram. That's the difference between laminar flow. So a fully formed laminar flow will form a parabolic curve, which has a long transitional length, and a turbulent flow will create basically a pressure head, really, really low pressure, and we can use that pressure. And again, the velocity difference. If we look at this water here, laminar flow, directional turbulent, laminar, turbulent, laminar, turbulent. Straight away, you can see the difference between laminar and turbulent. It's not doing the textbook big eddies. We won't see that unless we have, you know, a wall in the way, and then we get an eddy wrapped around the back of, you know, an object. And you can see in the water, one is low velocity, laminar, and then one is high velocity, high inertia, turbulent. And it's directional turbulence, and that's what we're using. And Kolmogorov's theory talks about the eddy sizes that we're dealing with. Convection eddies are as small as red blood cells, and they're the ones that interact with the boundary layer and create that convection. And the convection is directly related to the RA. And the RA is related to the activity of it. And again, that's what helps us turn air. If we have a short turn that's too smooth, we're going to create separation. And again, pressure gradients and everything we'll get into. But this is what I wanted to cover and explain, that the eddies aren't the size of, you know, half the size of the pipe or so on. They can be, again, if we have really, really bad valve guides and port angles, Yes, they will be behind the valve guide, but again, some decent shaping will eliminate most of this, because I've seen some comments saying, oh, you know, you're always going to have pockets with a poppet valve. That's not true. If you learn how to shape ports and do it right, you can minimize all this to having very, very small dead areas, almost eliminating them all. And the higher the port angle goes up, the more the less directional flow we have on a valve. In other words, if we're flowing air across the valve stem, obviously the pressure front is going to hit that valve across the length of it and want to create eddies around the back. But as we lift the port angle, it has a longer shear time now. It's shearing around it. And then if we're really, really smart and we put a nice shark fin separator in there, a directional shark fin, which will help separate the air, and then rather than it coming around and colliding in each other, it meets that fin and guides into the port, right, or into the cylinder, I should say. So again, as we increase the port angle, it reduces how much shear stress that valve itself is going to create, and we reduce and almost eliminate any turbulence on the backside of the stem. So all right, let's go into the next part. So again, we talked about the Moody diagram and obviously Newtonian fluids like air. And if you look at that diagram, you'll see that not only that laminar flow flows in a straight line across drag and speed, but its limitations to its Reynolds numbers. And generally the transitional area between laminar and turbulent is that 2.5 to 4,000 RE, where engines can be as high as 100,000 RE. So again, we're operating at far, far higher velocities than to even be able to use a laminar flow. Again, because the layers don't intermix, we get no convection, no shear in that. So if we have a wet fuel in the induction pipe that we are trying to reduce that DSM size, we're trying to reduce the size of the fuel molecule, then laminar flow really isn't going to do it for us. Now, I wanted to feed into what I was talking about with the valve stem and how a valve looks, or how a valve can change shape as it looks to air. Meaning, if you've ever cut exhaust pipe or whatever, the smallest cross-sectional area is at 90 degrees. And as we cut, we start to make an oval shape, something that is more aerodynamic to air. So that is the shape of a valve stem cut at 45 degrees. So now if the air coming in and transitioning into the valve stem itself, it'll now see a nice oval versus a round object, which we're going to get a hell of a lot of eddies around. So this is why port velocity and also the gradient and angles are super critical when approaching a valve stem, because just by the approach angle, we can improve the aerodynamic shape of a valve stem, even though we're not changing the shape. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, put something in the comments and I'll break it down some more. But all right, so now we're going to go into pressure gradients. So as you can see by this diagram, where all the pressure is on the 90-degree bend, and this is why optimally mandrel bend isn't the best for turning a corner. And again, you can see by the pressure gradient in the corner, this is why I say we need to look at both the velocity gradients and the pressure gradients to understand what's actually happening. And this should really be common sense. Last week we were talking about runner angle and how that changes downstream flow. Well, again, when I was talking about the pressure gradient that it creates on the floor, it'll also create another pressure gradient further on down in the port. Because again, we're dealing with a compressible fluid. We're dealing with a spring. Think of a shock absorber. With the spring itself, without the absorber, the harmonics will keep going, right? Air does the same thing. Once it compresses, it wants to spring back out, and we create a harmonic in the air as well. This is why changes or sudden changes in cross-sectional area are not only bad for inertia and obviously velocity, but they're bad for harmonics. They're bad for creating wasted energy, basically. It's probably the easiest way to put it. So I'm going to do a couple more diagrams on the board, and we're going to talk about now this pressure gradient and port angles and how it affects the port downstream, and also the stabilization of the short turn depending on the port angle, because I had a question on one of the videos on this. So let's cover that. Okay, so hopefully understanding the pressure gradient. Again, we're dealing with compressible fluids, so when we turn air wants to go straight. So even though we're going to get a different velocity gradient, on the far side of the turn, we're going to get pressure building up on that wall, and this is a pressure gradient. In fluid mechanics, especially with pipeline stuff, they do a hell of a lot of research into this with bends to try and stop what they call long side erosion from that pressure gradient, because the air is going to push on that far turn, or the fluid, the water, or whatever they're using. Generally it's waters or fuels or whatever it may be. Water is the worst because it has such high skin friction. It's not as viscous as fuel and other things. So I put some pictures on the board to show the pressure gradient, because I had a question, sorry, can't remember who asked it, but it was about runner angle and downstream effects. How does runner angle affect our downstream flow or pressure gradient? So I'm going to show you on a pressure gradient style, because I was talking about this the other day. When we kick the runner up, we're going to get that pressure gradient on the floor. And there's also going to be again, because we have the pressure gradient, and I was explaining this in the other video, we're going to get a density gradient as well, top to bottom, meaning the air up the top, even though it's might be flowing slower, can still be thinner. And again, because this is momentarily, this is an acceleration mechanism. So, you've heard the saying is, pressure is equal. So in a cylinder, pressure is equals because we have no velocity. The instant we have velocity, we have an imbalance. And the helium balloon in the car showed that the other day. As soon as we accelerate, the balloon will come forward with us. That's because the air is shifting. We're getting more dense air in the back of the cab than we are in the front. So instead of the density being vertical in the car, so most dense gas at the floor of the car, least dense at the roof. As soon as we accelerate, we get this happening. Hence why the balloon wants to go forward, and vice versa around the corners. When we turn into the corner, the dense air goes that way, the balloon goes that way. So as the question was, this 100% affects downstream flow and the density gradient, and will cause separation sooner, because again, air will come in, it gets compressed along the floor, and then it wants to skip off the short turn. And again, we'll see that density gradient much as we're seeing it in the diagram I showed you of the bend. And here's an actual optimal bend. That's what it looks like. This was the shape I was explaining the other day, and I'll see if I can share some photos from one of the super bikes on their new port design, exhaust port. But this is the gradient we're talking about, and what we tend to do, and you'll see this in a lot of big RPM stuff. You also see it in a lot of blower class racing now. We start to pitch the runners under the center line of the port, and not by a lot, but there's a few things that are going to happen here. So if we extend the port center line, you'll see the runner is slightly downhill. Now what this does is improve the pressure gradient across the port. So we're still going to get that pressure gradient on the far side, but what it does is it tends to push back at the short side and create more short side stability, because now all this air, and especially if we get the speed right, if we can turn that pressure front properly, meaning the air up here needs to be a little faster than the air up here, because if we look at the distance that has to cover versus the distance that has to cover for the same arc ratio, you'll see that distance is greater than that distance. This should be obvious. So this is where that shaping, that diagram I just showed, comes into it. So, and this is why we don't want a round mandrel, because a round mandrel means all the velocity is the same, hence why we lose pressure here and we create separation, turbulence, and reduce that cross-sectional area in the bend. So the idea of this sort of shape is the air will be much faster in the top half than the bottom half, which allows the top part of the air to turn with this air as well. And that will give it pressure stability. So it's like going around the racetrack with another car. You can lean on him a little bit. Well, they can all lean on each other. Obviously, they're intermixing, but it has support. When air is too quick on the short turn, that's when it just skips off because it's getting in front of the other part of the air on the roof as well. So we've got to look at that aspect as well. So I'll clean this off, and now we'll get into saturation points and why some cylinder heads turn to absolute crap at specific lifts or different things. Let's do it. All right, what is our saturation point? What's it do? What's it affect? How does it influence the cylinder head? And what do we need to know? That's what I'm going to cover just quickly as we finish up today. There was some other questions. I might just have a quick look at that and cover that before we finish up. But basically, the saturation point, or the point of saturation, so the point at where the curtain area, so this area here, obviously gets bigger as the valve lifts. That's what we call the curtain area. And the saturation point is when that area becomes bigger than our minimal cross-sectional area in the port, meaning that until we exceed our saturation point, meaning until this area becomes bigger than our minimal cross-sectional area, our high velocity area is always at the valve seat, meaning we can compensate for a poorly designed port if we stay under our saturation point, which in most cases, as soon as we start getting more serious, we can't. So again, this will happen relative to valve size and MCA. I've got a calculator for this on that I did originally on my Bain Racing, which is all on Einstein Motors site now. But the idea or the principle is that, say we have a 100 thou lift. Well, the air moving through the port now, really, depending where the MCA is, it's nowhere near as critical because this now is our high speed. So everything above that is much lower. But the problem is in the transition. So let's say we get to 600 thou, a Cleveland or something like that, 550, 600 thou, the head just turns to absolute crap. And the reason why is because our dynamic MCA now goes from this point to bam, way up here. And now the high velocity is here. And now the high velocity doesn't want to make the turn anymore. And then that's why we hear separation or more turbulence and so on. And we start to lose that cross-sectional area, and you'll see the head nosing off on the flow bench rather than carrying the CFM. And that has to do with the saturation point. So while we're under the saturation point, you really don't know how bad the port is. As soon as you get over that saturation point, and if you do, you really start to highlight a bad minimal cross-sectional area, a bad short turn, and so on. But again, the further away it is, the less affected it is. This is why a lot of the modern four valves, I should say, they're at the port window. So they've got a really long divergent section. This makes them really, really easy on airspeed, less problems, and so on. But that's our saturation point. This is why some heads turn to absolute garbage at certain lifts, because the instant we shift the high speed up into the port rather than having the valve seat ring, then we really start to see how bad the port is. Again, I might cover a little bit more of this in a later video, but hopefully that gives you an idea of what the saturation point is and why it's important once you start getting into big lift camshafts and, you know, trying to make some decent horsepower. All right, so another question I had was from Bradford's garage about Pipe Max and CSA. He's playing with a 3-valve engine, and he was asking how relevant Pipe Max CSA estimates are to 4 valves. One area I see a change in is minimal cross-sectional area, and I was talking about that the other day. Again, a 4-valve, a 2-valve, I should say, there's a roughly an 80% rule. Again, it really depends, sometimes more. So with the 4 valves, I tend to like bigger minimal cross-sectional areas, so lower peak velocity, that dynamic element that we would calculate, and better average velocity across the port. And again, a lot of the early 90s ports were absolute trash in the 4-valve scene as far as two intakes go. And this is applying to Bradford's engine that he's talking about. It had 2 inlets, 1 exhaust, the 3 valves in the Fords, the Mustangs, and so on and so on. We did a little bit with these probably a decade ago. They also had bias ports, so they actually contributed to swirl. They had the flat valve, similar to the CA, the guys that know the Nissan stuff, similar to some of the early Ford stuff with the flat valve in the port, dual port. The idea was the port was too big for low RPM, so they'd block one port and then open it up. Never worked really well, hence why manufacturers moved away from that and you know, went into variable cam timing and stuff like that. But yeah, so the question was, how close is Pipe Max on its CSA? And again, I tend to go on the slower side depending on what head it is, or we actually weld the pipes up. Now, the other problem with OEM is some of the areas are much bigger than they need to be because they have bends in them. And again, this comes back to our pressure gradients in the pipes and obviously our flow gradients. Because we have a bend, we're going to reduce that cross-sectional area. So what OEM do to compensate, so they still get their harmonic lengths long enough to create plenty of torque, the diameters are much bigger. And even some port entries, we've seen this in the 4G63 in the non-turbo, massive windows, choke down really quick. The European CA18s, I actually do a full weld up on one of those. I might show some pictures. We did a race car in Sweden. Yeah, we basically changed the whole shape. I might even pull the port molds out if I've got them, because that's something I get into as well. We actually port mold pretty much every head we're developing. And it gives you a really good indication when you see a port mold rather than looking into a port. It really tells you a whole nother story on port, and it's easy to measure cross-sectional area as well and just see how it's going to flow visually. So yeah, be really, really careful going off what OEM have, and most of the early stuff was too big, so in some cases you actually want to shrink it down to lift that velocity up. But obviously the balance from entry to valve seat is key. So if we, you know, if the window is 50% bigger than the MCA, then the window is too big or the MCA is too small. So we've got to use a little bit of common sense. But yeah, I tend to target the twin cam stuff as low as 600 on our feet per second at our minimal cross-sectional area, some even lower, especially with the turbo stuff. The higher the boost goes up, generally the less they want to flow at those high velocity rates. So as we increase density, we increase port drag. So there's a little shift we'll see there as far as the calculation goes. But in some later videos, we might actually go down and get into the actual calculations of 4-valve, because I know some guys on here are interested in 4-valve stuff. We do a hell of a lot of it. We've been in design. We've just finished another billet RB26 head for boost stock, and we're developing ports for that. But we'll get into a little bit of the maths on that, and also how to actually measure the port itself, because some people struggle with CSA in the twin cam stuff. So I'll show you how to measure it. Well, the easiest way I've come up with, again, there's lots of different ways to do it, whatever works best for you, but I'll show you my way, and if it works, great. All right, guys, I'll see you next time. Again, thanks for all the comments. Keep them coming, and if you've got something you want me to clarify on, pop it in there. See you next time.